So just waiting momentarily for Skippy to join, at which point I will invite him in. But in the meantime, it's a really beautiful day here in the backyard in Woody Creek, and I'm feeling grateful to have a chance to be outside and hang with some friends. So, have not yet seen Skippy join, though he did just text me. And so, we're working on it. There he is. Hey, Skippy. All right, so I'm going to add you.
Yeah, it will be.
I assume you have to accept it. And there you are. What's up, bud?
What's going on, man? How are you?
I'm well. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me. This is fun. I've never done this before.
Yeah, this is an interesting experiment. I definitely think that an actual conversation is a much better way to hash through this stuff than sort of an endless string of text walls being hurled back and forth, because it certainly seems those are easier things to write than they are to read.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. And if ever there's a time for like depth of community conversation centered around a mutual desire to do well, like this is it. So thank you.
Yeah, you bet, man. And thanks for joining me despite the I actually think that may have been our first ever interaction on social media. So an inauspicious start, and I appreciate that we're able to get it back on track a bit.
No, it's
so.
Yep. Okay.
No, go ahead, please.
I was just gonna say, I have an interesting interaction with social media, wherein I make a point to every direct message, email, phone call, text. I respond to every single one, but I actually don't read Facebook comments normally, and I don't respond to them because it becomes a 5-hour-a-day job that I can't keep up with, and it's also. For whatever reason, it's a difficult place to have a conversation, and so I try to reach out directly. And it's like one of the most gratifying parts of this job is when you reach out to someone who has a criticism and you can start a conversation. And like when you're able to break through that and co-create solutions, like those are just like the moment that make you so happy to be in this role. So
sure, you bet. Obviously, I said some fairly aggressive things on Monday in my comments to you. I assume you've read them now. You didn't read the things I said.
I haven't read them all. No, I mean, I don't know, how many different comments are where, so I'm sure there are things I haven't read. I read the comment that I responded to, and that was it. It's just been direct.
Yeah, the one on Monday. That was so that's interesting because the meanest thing I said was that, based on your easy adoption, or based on the easy way with which you were, musing about, what I view as a quite authoritarian leap, that to me rendered you unfit in my mind for public leadership. And I have to say that, not much that I've seen in the, I actually don't get to vote in Pitkin County, or in the city of Aspen, rather. I do get to vote in Pitkin County, although I do have an 81611 zip code at my home address. And so, I'm not actually a city of Aspen voter at the moment anyway. But, and so I don't pay a ton of attention to City of Aspen politics because, frankly, whether this hotel gets built or that development gets approved doesn't have a whole lot of bearing on my life.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I said that based on that easy acquaintance with mandates, that demonstrated a lack of fitness, based in sort of naivete. And I have to say that since I've been paying more attention over the following several days, I haven't really sort of backed off from that sense. And it's interesting for me to hear that sort of you responded privately to my having made those comments, but it's interesting for me to learn that you didn't actually read those comments.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty remarkable to me, actually, in terms of sort of like a process for gathering knowledge about public sentiment.
Well, what I'm saying is that, I mean, I read your initial comment that I responded to. What I'm saying is that Facebook discussions tend to be quite unwieldy and very long and
Sure, sure.
diffuse. And so what I'm saying is, based on what I've seen, how other people interact with that platform, there's probably other comments that you made that I just haven't seen yet because they're in a different place, or and
Oh,
I don't.
got it. No, no, no.
Yeah.
The only comments I made were the ones in response
Okay.
to your post and on your posting thread.
Good.
Other than the one I made, encouraging this, or sort of announcing that this conversation would be taking
I read
place.
that one too.
Okay, cool. So I'm less disturbed by that then, because I guess sort of one of the things that I've observed in sort of like observing your stylistic modality in communicating with the public is I see a lot of public facing monologues in a broadcast modality. And what I see in those are mostly fairly banal platitudes. And then it seems that most of the sort of like substantive conversations are taking place in private telephone calls and or instant messages or the like. And so when I suggested that we have this conversation in public, and you said, well, that's a really unusual approach, but you're down.
Yeah.
It was like I think it should be less unusual, and so anyway, like a thing that I sort of wrote down as I was thinking this morning, and I'll read it real quick if that's okay with you. The greatest difference maker in outcomes between countries appears to be governmental competence. I think Aspen and Pitkin County have incredibly competent professionals and a well-informed, thoughtful, and cooperative public, which has vastly mitigated the impact of this pandemic, obviously, for which we're both quite grateful. I think that we've also seen a lot of like pretty bad sense making occurring as part of this pandemic. A lot of sort of like conspiratorial push, a lot of sort of like so there's a lot of conspiratorial push on the one side,
Yeah.
And then on the other side there's been a what I would call sort of like a tendency of denial of reality on the part of a lot of our global and national level institutions. I think the lurching from a position of masks don't work for the public to masks are mandatory in a period of a couple weeks demonstrates is sort of emblematic of that denial of reality on the institutional side. Which effectively mirrors the denial of reality on the more conspiratorial side.
I would agree that both of, maybe you're not asking for my comment, but I would agree that the two bookends that you describe are accurate observation. To use the mask example as an example of one of those, I don't necessarily agree with, but I don't think we're going to.
I can unpack that, but I think sort of like, why don't we, instead of unpacking the mask example, let's jump into sort of exploring this mandatory, and mandatory is the word that I keep emphasizing on this in terms of contact tracing.
Yeah.
And why I and others think that's such a bad idea, and maybe not worthy.
Can I just preface
please,
that question with the I also think it's a bad idea? And when I say it's a bad idea, I don't mean that it is. Look, I mean, here's how this works, right? If you're in this role, is you have multiple 20, 30, 40-minute conversations. You hand over 400 emails, and what gets chosen is not up to you, right? And so. And it tends to be the thing that catches the most attention, which I understand the mechanics behind that. And
The
so,
mechanics of how that newspaper article came out, you mean?
yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And so, like, for me, when you talk about sense making, it's impossible to make sense of a scenario without complete information. My process for that is to look for those bookends, to look for existing examples of things that have had an effect, and then to say, okay, where on this spectrum should we fall, or should we push beyond those? And I'm a person who generally is frankly not on the extremes. Like I'm looking for some form of middle ground, but to blind oneself to something that has worked in another place, to fail to even discuss it, to me, inhibits good sense making. And so then I have a conversation with a reporter for about 30 minutes. And while part of this is a mandatory app, that represents the bookend, right? That's something that, like, I understand how some would say you should never, no matter what, get there. To me, if the data is anonymized and the alternative is everybody stays home for a year and families starve, like, okay, there's some scenario where I would consider it. But is it something that I desire or find inherent merit with? Of course not. And the way that's evidenced, and you know that, is because prior to this scenario, it was something that I had never spoken about. And what I made quite clear to that reporter is, like, that's a worst case scenario, but we need to consider everything, right? And it's like the last place you'd want to go, but to not think about it is crazy.
So, I guess there's a few things that I would sort of want to address in the statement you just made, but the first is sort of you've talked a lot about sort of not liking artificial binaries, and yet there was like a pretty big glaring artificial binary in the statement you just made. And
draw that out for me. Let's workshop that.
It was the alternatives are mandatory contact tracing or remain in lockdown for a year and all the businesses die.
Right, and those are not the choices. I'm saying if we were living in a scenario where that was the choice, as we move forward into exploring like the entire panoply of things that we could do that may or may not have anything to do with an app or a digital space, if the result of that conversation was a choice between those two things, in that scenario, and basically only in that scenario, is where I could see it as something worth considering, right? And so if it's worth considering at any point within the spectrum, then I think to facilitate good sense making, it needs to be part of that conversation. That's all I'm saying.
Got it. Kind of got it. I'm not sure I totally got it. But in any case, sort of like, my view is, so actually here's what I would say. I read the article after I read your addition of context about the article.
Okay.
And was responding far more to your addition of context rather than the article itself, though I did read that also before responding. And in that addition of context, you used a phrase that I've heard you use several times subsequently, and that phrase is, all options need to be on the table.
Yeah.
And, here's my view. Like, the phrase, all options need to be on the table, sounds really good coming from, like, a, politician in an action movie. But not only are you not putting all options on the table, because there are lots of like really bad options that are bad enough ideas that they were unworthy of consideration in addition to your matrix of possibilities.
That's fair.
It also, my view is basically that the mandatory contact tracing is an idea so transparently bad as to sort of like not survive an initial 2 or 3 questions before sort of like being dismissed as a potentiality. And I think that like that's probably an inevitability, and so in that regard, this conversation is a little bit of a moot point. But I'm going to go ahead and ask those questions if you don't mind, because I think it's sort of like a useful exercise in examining lots of further situations, which
No,
which sort
that's
of like,
great, Tyler. It's great, Tyler, and actually, I really appreciate the exercise because it's one that hasn't yet happened, right? I mean, the emails that were sent were the result of me trying to start a conversation that hadn't happened and that was over, in my view, is overdue for happening if we are going to find a path to safely reopen our economy. So yeah, let's do it, man.
okay, great. So, a lot of the questions that, or actually, there's sort of three primary questions, and I sourced these from the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is a nonprofit focused on civil liberties on the internet. And the questions are fairly simple. Question one, would it be effective?
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
There's like you understand, right? Like we're talking about. Maybe it would be helpful for you to clarify when you say it, what you mean.
Would a regime of mandatory contact tracing done digitally? So would a regime of mandatory digital contact tracing be an effective way to combat the pandemic?
Well, in a vacuum, certainly not, right? It could potentially be a tool that works in conjunction with other tools to combat a pandemic.
So let me ask the question a little bit differently then.
Okay.
Would a mandatory digital contact tracing app be more effective than a voluntary digital contact tracing app?
I do not have enough information to answer that question.
Okay, I have some suggesting information.
Okay.
So the first piece of evidence would be from Australia, where they have experimented a little bit with mandatory apps.
Read a piece and what they...
Great. Did you read about any of the sort of like spoofing or hoaxes that have been done as protests to that app?
I haven't read about that, no.
Okay, so that's been something that's happening, and it's something that you see also in sort of like, there was a really funny hack that I read about a couple months ago that related to Waze and Google Maps. So this guy noticed that Waze was sending lots of traffic down his relatively quiet suburban street. And his way of spoofing that was to get a whole bunch of Android phones and drag them up and down the street in a little red wagon. And all of a sudden it looked to the algorithms as though there was a traffic jam on his street. Yeah. Fairly clever, right?
Yeah.
That turns that data into useless garbage.
Sure.
And so if a mandatory app is more likely than a voluntary app to be subject to that kind of like electronic protest, it would certainly be less effective than a voluntary app.
I could see a scenario where that would be accurate, but it would, I guess, in this scenario, and I don't want to have this statement be a defense of a mandatory app. That's not what I'm saying, but like just as a thought experiment as we think through this, there's a scenario where that's correct, right? Where the corrupting factor of that protest degrades the data as such that it becomes less useful than the population in the non-mandatory app. That would depend on what the population in the non-mandatory app is. Is uptake 99%, 25%, 75%? It would also depend on, do those protesters who are protesting the mandatory app also protest the non-mandatory app? If they do so, do they do so at the same rate and with the same ferocity, or do they do a different one, right? So I take your point as valid and a possibility, but I think there's other questions in that.
So, then like another sort of like evidentiary point would be Singapore. And I would note that Singapore is a far more authoritarian country than the United States.
Very much agree.
I mean, obviously they have a competent government, but they have a pretty authoritarian government.
Yes. And
even in Singapore, a mandatory app was definitely not adopted. I don't know if you sort of clicked on the Wired article that I posted in the comment thread on your post.
I haven't.
Okay, so it goes into detail on the Singapore example pretty heavily, and they quote a blog post from the software developer that actually wrote Singapore's voluntary app. And I'm gonna read it verbatim because I think it's instructive.
Sure.
If you ask me whether any Bluetooth contact tracing system deployed or under development anywhere in the world is ready to replace manual contact tracing, I will say without qualification that the answer is no. Not now, and even with the benefit of AI and machine learning, or God forbid blockchain, throw whatever buzzword you want, not for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I think that's spot on, right? I mean, there's no question about that comment. Um, there's no one with any seriousness who is suggesting in any way that an app can supplant contact tracing from individuals. The question is, can it be an added tool to make them more effective? Right? That's really what you're getting at, because at the end of the day, somebody actually has to do the manual work of reaching out to people, taking in their experience, taking them in for care, isolating them, all that stuff. The question is, if you are able to know where someone who has been sick was, and again, anonymously, like you don't need to know who these people are, but are you able to then contact manually those other nodes of connection quicker before they go out and make a bunch of other nodes? Like that's really what the tool is being used for. It's to stand up those groups, not to supplant them.
So that's kind of the would it be effective question, and I don't know if you have to that question, but certainly the jury's out.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people are trying it because the situation's really dire, and we're looking for the best way forward, and we're all kind of learning together. So yeah, I mean, I don't have a data set from Australia to tell you what the increased rate or decreased rate of effectiveness is.
So given that the jury's still out on whether it would be effective, I think that alone would be disqualifying for the idea of a mandatory act. To make something mandatory that we don't know would be effective feels like a fairly obvious disqualification, which I'll give you an opportunity to respond to, but otherwise I'll move on to the second question.
Well, I mean, look, I mean, I'm not a. I think the fact that it hasn't worked is not a disqualifier to try something in general, right? Like just because you've never landed a double
backflip. But trying things doesn't often coincide with mandatory.
Well, do me a favor though. Like, let me finish the statement. It's like,
sure, apologies.
Just because it hasn't doesn't mean it can't. It's just like, your first double backflip or whatever, or you hadn't landed one before you landed one. So I think the idea that something is entirely disqualified because it hasn't happened is invalid. I think what is very valid is to say it would make absolutely no logical step to make that your first test, right? You wouldn't go to that solution first. You would try a bunch of solutions that didn't have the inherent and really bad trade-offs that could facilitate the same end result you're looking for first, right? I think that makes a lot of sense. In the same way that the first time you got on a snowboard, your first thing you did wasn't try a double backflip. It was like, how do I use my backside edge to stop?
Yeah, you got to start from simple principles for sure. And actually, you basically stated the second question just now, which is, would it do too much harm to justify the effectiveness?
It depends on the rest of the constraints. I mean, I think to do it now for no reason, like, ask the question again. Ask the question again in a different way, because it feels very diffuse to me right now.
Sure. Maybe I'll just read what the EFF wrote, because I think it unpacks it pretty effectively.
Okay.
Even if the government shows that a surveillance power would be effective, EFF still opposes it if it would too greatly burden our freedoms.
Yeah.
High-tech surveillance can turn our lives into open books. It can chill and deter our participation in protests, advocacy groups, and online forums. Its burdens fall all too often on people of color, immigrants, or other vulnerable groups. Oh, I might have lost him. I think I lost him.
What you're saying makes sense. I don't yet see in my head exactly.
Bear with us, folks.
I could see how I could back into that from an existing participant and then turn that into something, but it's like hard for me to. Yeah, that one I need to get some thought to.
Connection issues, and I lost him. So we will rejoin
That's more what I'm thinking.
momentarily. I just got a question from We Are Ocean. No, he is a city councilman. So here in Aspen, we have 4 city council members and a mayor for a total of 5, which means that we run into, 3 to 2 votes on controversial issues.
Process as it is applied, and so I feel like I've got my.
So just waiting for Skippy to rejoin. I'm not sure if his internet went down or what, but I hope people are finding this useful. I think I think it's hard to say mean things to people when you're looking right at their face, and it's really easy to say mean things in text form on these Facebook threads. So this is certainly a better venue for making sense of complex issues than is a Facebook thread. All right. Skippy's back. We lost him for a moment, but I am logging him back in.
Right, so that we could definitely do, and we could take little bits of it, right? So,
All right, welcome back.
Sorry about that. It's like outside in the sun, and my phone, even though it's 60 degrees, decided to go into hot temperature protect mode.
Gotcha. The very funny comment from Aspen Art Curation. I don't speak snowboarding. Can you guys use ski analogies instead? That's great. So anyway, the question was, even if it were determined to be effective, would it do more harm than good? And so, that's obviously a question that can be asked of a lot of the policy interventions during this moment. And so to sort of start over because I'm not sure when I lost you, but I'm just going to start that EFF paragraph over from scratch, if that's cool. It says, even if the government shows that a surveillance power would be effective, EFF still opposes its use to greatly burden our freedoms. It can turn our lives into open books. It can chill and deter advocacy groups and online forums. Its burdens fall all too often on people of color, immigrants, and other vulnerable groups. Breaches of government data systems can expose intimate details about our lives to scrutiny by adversaries, including identity thieves, foreign governments, and stalkers. In short, even if surveillance would be effective at solving a problem, it must also be necessary and proportionate to that problem and not have an outsized impact on vulnerable groups. And to underscore that, I would point you or our audience to an article in today's New York Times, which talks a bit about the social distancing regulations in New York. And there have been 40 instances of police contact to enforce, or there have been 40 instances of arrests under these social distancing guidelines. 35 of them have been African Americans, 4 of them Latinos, and a single white person has been arrested under that policy. So, the question of, even if it works, would it do too much harm? That's where that question comes from.
Yeah, and I saw an Instagram post yesterday about the pad chain lock fence in Harlem and the empty park, and then over in Brooklyn, people out everywhere. There are huge inequities in this response, both medical and in the non-medical, that are really awful. Honestly, I don't think your question is one that there is a clear response to.
I disagree, my friend. I think there is a clear response, and the harm would not justify the effectiveness.
And I hear you, but look, we all. It would depend on what the tool was, first and foremost, right? Does that tool gather your personal information, or does it only gather where you were, right? So does the receiving body have information to your social security, your name, your voting records. Like, there's a lot of stuff that would be really scary. That would be quite different from something that was entirely anonymous, right? Where the only thing that was provided, your phone number. Now, I understand why or how you could get to, even that is way, way too much. But, you know, we're already giving up that metadata, right? And we could sit here and say that shouldn't be happening and it's a huge mistake, but that's already happening. So I'm not here like justifying that. I'm just saying that, like, unless you understand specifically what's being collected and who it's being collected by, it's hard to answer that question. Like, I've spent time in places, North Korea, for instance. Like, I went there, and I wouldn't give up, you know, so much as a text to that government. I would give up nothing to that government, right, at all, because I see what they do with it. I feel differently when I'm at home because I frankly have more trust in our institutions than I do theirs. So yeah, there are certainly things that I think are sacrosanct and that should not be given up. Yes. But to answer your question based on a hypothetical app that doesn't exist and we don't have the constraints of, I think is hard.
Okay, so I don't think it's hard, and I think we actually just came across a I think significant point of difference, and to me it points to why people were so upset by it. Yeah. And why that level of upset wasn't sort of like anticipated and avoided in how you communicate about it.
Can you share?
Of course, I intend to. Look, the problem is not what's being collected. The problem is the coercion at the heart of the collection. So, while we are having this conversation on my Android phone, and that obviously subjects me to a tremendous amount of data capture by Google, theory Google is a voluntary one. And the relationship with a government is far less voluntary. And so it matters less what's being collected by that government and far more whether we have a choice or not in that collection.
Okay. So I think that's totally fair, and I agree with the premise that a non-voluntary or a voluntary system would be far preferable to a non-voluntary system. Like, that's very, very obvious to me. So maybe like that's a good moment to sort of pivot and have the broader discussion about, you know, where do we go from here? Because
I'm not ready to pivot. I still have a bunch more stuff.
Okay. Jump in. Yeah, no, I totally agree, right? I 1,000% agree.
So, you know, the question is, would a mandatory app, would the harm caused by that mandatory app do too much harm, be too great to justify the effectiveness of that app? And, you know, my suggestion is yes, it would. And there's a great piece of evidence that we can look at, which is the mere suggestion of it in a hypothetical way caused a fairly incredible amount of division within our community.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, like,
but it's also true, Tyler, that you know, we don't yet know if something like that is required, necessary, or helpful, right? And hopefully we don't have to find out. But we are progressing through this outbreak that is new to us. And there are very real scenarios staring down the barrel of the gun at us where we could lose half or more businesses in our town, where we could see half or more people out of work, where we could see people leaving in droves, where we could see hungry kids. I mean, we're talking some pretty serious stuff, right? And so
it is indeed scary, yeah.
Any harm needs to be weighed against the opposing harm, and hopefully we never need to get to a position where we're considering that.
I want to pause you because you invented another one of these false binaries.
I'm saying that I'm not intending to invent a false binary. What I'm trying to do is explain that as we look at the progression of this thing, we will constantly be looking at a variety of choices along the way. And hopefully we never get to that binary. Hopefully that's not the binary that we end up at. And hopefully when we get there, there are multiple options if we get there. But it is somewhere where we could end up. And so, you know, at that moment, that will be our choice. And hopefully we don't get there. Hopefully there's a million ways that we can deal with this so that that's not even within our scope of inquiry, right?
But given that that is sort of within our scope of inquiry today, have you done any sort of like envisioning of what a mechanism of enforcement might be to enforce that mandate?
No, because when I was talking about this, sorry, no, I haven't, because
okay,
it's very frustrating for me because I feel like I inhabit a universe as an elected official with a body whose history is to not discuss anything with the public, to not bring the public into decision making, to keep everything insular until it's perfect and then tell the public what to do. And I hate that. And I think it is an outdated mode of leadership. And I think it doesn't reflect where we need to be going as a community. And I think we need to have open conversations that include the public from the beginning in the decision making to make decisions together. And I am trying my best to start to activate that type of decision-making architecture, and I get a huge amount of incoming from the organization that is resistant to that change, and it often feels like the people that would be most desirous of that change, because of, you know, whether it's my mistakes in how I present things or how the newspaper presents them, like, are coming at and attacking me for the position, which isn't even my position. You know, it's like I could not have been more clear to Carolyn that I'm not calling for this.
To the extent that you believe it should still be on the table, you own that position. I'm saying let's take that off the table because it's such a transparently bad idea, and dedicate more attention to positive ideas. I think, you know, with all due respect, Skippy, like you have a really well-worn delivery of sort of like this notion of a new kind of politics, but what I see in actual observed behavior is very much a broadcast modality, very much a monologue modality, in which you almost never have your ideas challenged in a public way. And the private challenge, I think I may have lost him again.
No, I'm right here.
Oh, no, you're still there. Okay, I'm just getting a little bit of circle of them.
I think what you describe is your observation viewed through the prism of an online platform. Like, the amount of time that it took me to craft a few sentences and 3 emails to Ward Hauenstein about this reflected probably somewhere in the vicinity of 6 minutes of my time over the course of 7 weeks. During that time, I'm working 12 to 18 hours a day, 7 days a week on everything else. So it's just inaccurate.
Okay, I think that's a fair and valid defense. I guess, like, I guess I would try and go back to sort of like, you know, given that it was so upsetting, I just find it strange that, you know, it continues to sort of like be something that's kept on the table when, like, I'm trying to think of something that would be sort of like outlandish in the other direction. You know, an official city policy, denying the existence of the coronavirus as a danger. You know, as an example.
But I don't think, Tyler, in any serious way, I don't think in any way it's being considered right now as a policy. Like, no one's even, like, the only conversation that's having about it is on message boards on Facebook. No one's talking about it at City Hall. No one's talking about it at county commissioners. Nobody's talking about it at board of health meetings. Nobody's talking about it except for people that were upset that it's being talked, that it has been talked about in a very small way.
So wouldn't an effective strategy just be like, man, I read all these comments, and yeah, you know what? Like, I agree. Let's remove that from our list of options if it is so problematic.
It's I guess, okay, so let me try and let's work through this publicly. Because
that was the point.
This is something that I really struggle with, right? On one hand, it's not on the list of options, right? Like, there's no list of options that are being considered that it's part of.
I mean, I can pull up your post in which you said, like,
I'm saying the decision-making body, like, you understand, do you understand the mechanics of who makes these decisions? Like, you understand that I have no actual decision-making power over this?
Calendar.
Sure. No, I mean, I get that it's legislation by committee, for sure.
And then I will wait for your email until I get something out to the rest of this group.
You get recommendations from staff, right?
I'm not in the county, I'm in the city.
May 30th is a Saturday, we know
I
that?
have a voice as a citizen as it pertains to this, and that is it, right? So I'm not in that decision-making
Got it, right,
other than
that makes sense.
Somebody may listen to me more because of my position. But there's nothing,
okay, cool.
Right? Like,
I'm
not
putting it in
that,
now.
that
Next
architecture, and
gen,
within
we
who is making those decisions and how they're
the
making them. This isn't being
new
considered.
world.
As far as I know, I'm not in.
No, I mean, I know that. I know that also.
Okay, cool. I can't believe you're making me do 8 a.m. on Saturday.
That I do have a lot of confusion.
I barely lived on Friday.
Yeah, the easy and expeditious thing to do in response
That's the same thing to me.
This backlash, let's call it, is to say, yep, totally 1,000% in any circumstance off the table. And yet, I don't think that's true for today, but that's not true in any scenario, right? And
So wouldn't it be meant to say, like, it's a dumb idea and it's not currently being considered, and then, like, end of it? But, like,
okay, well,
here's why. So this is what I'm like almost asking for your
partnership on this.
Is like,
it's super cool.
I feel like the dip and dodge, and like, okay, people didn't like it, so I'm going to pretend like I never said it, and I'm just going to like brush it under the rug, is such an example of like old school bullshit, right? Like, I'm actually interested in finding ways to have broad public conversations, right? And so I struggle with how to do that, because in my experience, and I would say this is very unfortunate, but it's objectively true from what I've experienced, the only things that bring people to the conversation to have a topic or a conversation are these things that, however unintentional, are very controversial. Like, if you try to
they're hyper salient, yeah,
around a conversation about something that isn't, no one shows up. And so I'm not here to draw controversy, and I don't like it. I don't find it productive or healthy, and I think most of the Facebook discussion demonstrates that. And yet, we're in this really critical decision-making moment where we have big decisions to be made, and there aren't anything we can pull off the shelf and say we know how this works. So if at any time there's a better moment for a conversation, it's now. And if I were to do what you recommended, I would do two things. Like, I would, one, be in some measure dishonest, which I don't ever want to do. And two, I would shut down a conversation that needs to be had, even if these weren't the constraints in which I would wish I would have it. So, like, what do you recommend? You know, like.
So I think sort of it's okay to have borders around what are sort of like open for consideration or not for yourself, you know, inside your head. So like there's a, you know, some of the things that have actually been most effective in navigating the coronavirus situation for a lot of different countries are strong border controls. I would cite New Zealand as a great example of strong border controls being sort of like the most effective mechanism that they had in limiting the initial spread and keeping it to a scale where manual contact tracing was you know, relatively easy and effective.
Yeah.
I would say Taiwan took a similar approach of like strong border controls, and they didn't even have a you know, mandatory lockdown or quarantine.
Right.
It was almost entirely voluntary, and they've been able to return to a pretty remarkable level of, you know, economic normalcy given the context. So I would suggest a similar set of controls around sort of like narrowing the scope of consideration so that you don't have this crazy needle in a haystack problem, where the number of things that you're required to consider becomes too vast for any mind to consider. And let me go on to further suggest that a useful rubric for whether things should be considered or not is their constitutionality. And this is a clear and obvious violation of the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution, which it's hard for me to imagine it surviving a legal defense. And so given that it falls outside of these 250-year-old principles, that might be a useful border against too much consideration of what's an obviously bad and unconstitutional idea.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I can totally hear that, and I think part of what I'm hoping that we do is begin to narrow that scope of inquiry. And part of the way that happens with elected officials is what does or doesn't have public support, right? I've just watched it, you know, the squeaky wheel.
The mask thing is an interesting one.
Right.
You know, so like I've seen very little objection to the mask mandate in Aspen.
Right.
I've seen a little bit, and I think you know it's a healthy amount. And I think that the reason that that the mask thing has not had a ton of objection is that it has a clear attachment to sort of like, oh, if I breathe my COVID breath on you, that's an act of aggression that in this context. So it's like, yeah, you know, like easy one that fits within time-honored principles here in the United States.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, yeah, I mean, sure, I'll take that.
And so like, you know, an easy way, if you were, you know, looking for an out that allowed you to remove, again, a mandatory, and I stress mandatory on purpose, contact tracing apps from consideration, whether personally or as body, you know, Pitkin and Aspen broadly. An easy heuristic for determining like, oh, this is not actually worthy of serious consideration by this body would be like, is it constitutional?
Yeah, and it would take exactly a 3-minute meeting with you know, the city attorney for him to say that, for me to say, yeah, great. But again, no one's looking at this.
Right.
Right, and that's pretty much what it would take. This isn't a hard lift. I mean, what I'm looking for is the conversation now. What I'm looking for is an act of citizenship. What I'm looking for is us figuring out how we meet our specific constraints. You talked about border controls, and I'm glad that that's a tool that's working for some. Then we have to ask the question, like, would it work in our local context? Maybe. I don't know. I don't have enough info, but we think about our tourist base, right? We're 25% international. We're the most international of any resort in Colorado, if not in the U.S. Let's assume that nothing else changed. The other 75% that are domestic, every single one of them kept their jobs, came at the same rate, but we got rid of those 25%. How would we do? Well, if a business or restaurant's operating at 8 and 12% margins, well, they're all going to go out of business, right? Assuming that people at the same rate visit restaurants. So like, you got to apply these things to the local. But you're right, that's exactly where you start. You're like, hey, what's working? Cool, could this work here? Could it be amended or bent to work better here, right? Like, these are the things that we need to be digging into.
So, you know, one of the observations that I heard recently, and I, you know, maybe take, so, when I announced this conversation, I posted a 3-circle Venn diagram that you also shared, and that you also recognize yourself as the me in that image.
Yeah.
I think most people do, right? That seems like a fairly difficult to agree with.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I heard the science fiction writer Cory Doctorow say recently that has really resonated with me is that one of the things that this pandemic has done is accelerated processes that are normally too slow as to be noticeable into hypersalience, right? So the amount of excess deaths that we're seeing, just off of like sort of an average year-to-year baseline of deaths. The thing that Dr. O cited was a BBC statistics podcast, which where the guy was saying, like, we're seeing the amount of deaths that we normally see in a year from infectious disease, we're seeing in a week. Or we're seeing many years worth of unemployment claims popping up in a week. Or we're seeing, just kind of like years worth of tragedy occurring in a week. And one of the ongoing processes that, is often too slow to be noticed, and then, it's like a sudden refrigerator hum that starts screeching, is the loss of civil liberties. And like, if I were to sort of like offer a direct criticism of what I've seen in your public communications, is that you have not demonstrated a sufficient concern with civil liberties in your public communications.
I can take that criticism.
So like, what I perceive here, and it doesn't need to be an individual governance official that sort of like takes agency in this, but I want to sort of bring up a quote from one of James Madison's letters to Thomas Jefferson back in the 1700s, and he says, that what I see here is the old trick of turning every contingency into a resource for accumulating force in government. So like, it doesn't need to be the will of any individuals within government for that to be sort of the ongoing process. In the same way that, like, no individual in an oil company necessarily is calling for the, avoidance of reckoning with, the economic externalities of their business. But it's in the interest of the organization to do so. Or to put another way, like, I obviously work for the Aspen Skiing Company. I would be unlikely to sort of like climb the corporate ladder at the skiing company if I were engaged in constant criticism of them in public and private. And so there's a natural incentive towards sort of like accumulation of power inside of government, broadly, in sort of the like runaway artificial intelligence sense. And officials that I here to support are those that sort of like take an active stance against that tendency.
Yeah, I can hear that.
And I think that's also the core of the, I'll leave it to the comment section to weigh in, but like, I think that's the core of the sort of like ferocity of the objection that you experienced in, this recent firestorm.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that and bringing the clarity to it. The element of our nation and our citizenship that's focused on individual rights and individual liberties is a really important one. I'm not one on either end who thinks that it's all or nothing. I think we make decisions every day to give up some of our liberties for some other benefit, and it's in small things that we may or may not agree with, like wearing seatbelts, to non-legal ones like yelling in a movie theater, right? I mean, I think it's an ongoing conversation, and I think that it's really important to have people, frankly, on the side that is probably further than I am naturally, to bring us to an equilibrium. So I think it's a really great service.
So, I feel like I've come to the end of the things that I wanted to say about this, and I really appreciate your time.
Yeah.
And I guess I just would sort of close with giving you an opportunity to give a final statement on this or whatever else you want to talk about.
Sure. Do we want to, like, I don't know if you're getting questions or anything in there. Do we want to do any of that, or just?
I haven't really been.
Okay. Okay. Cool. Yeah, man. I guess what I would say first is thank you, honestly, and I really mean that. These things aren't easy, right? Governing isn't easy. Running a city isn't easy. Being a person in crisis or losing your job isn't easy. And it frankly takes a lot of guts, intention, and care for someone to like jump on here with me and ask questions and just give of your time in this process. I think it's awesome. Like we will be a much better community if more people choose to do what you're doing, right? And so the first thing is just gratitude, honestly. The second thing is just not only do we not have to agree, we shouldn't agree. I'm a firm believer in that. Like I grew up in a Jewish tradition where argumentation was ever present, and it was never a hammer to bludgeon your opponent. It wasn't about proving that you were right. It was as you said, sense-making apparatus for us to bring in our diverse experiences with a genuine belief the other person wants what's best as well, thinking that we're right and making our case, but being open to being totally wrong, because people are wrong all the time. To me, argumentation is like the human expression of evolution, right? Within our own socio lives, right? Like nature's wrong all the time as it evolves, and that's how it lands on what's right, right? And it's like really about leveraging our differences as what can bring us together as a community to come to the best solutions. And like that is why I'm here in this role, right? So thank you for an opportunity in that, and for anybody watching, like let's all like put down the knives, man. Like let's assume the best, let's ask questions, let's bring our best ideas forward, and let's do what Tyler's doing and get involved. And if we do that, we'll have a better community.
Good. Yeah, no, and I would say, I guess if I were to close, by saying I enjoyed this, so thank you. And I think I would try out the old McLuhan quote that the medium is the message, and the medium of face-to-face conversation, even if digitally mediated, is likely to result in more effective, less wrong communal sense making. So,
totally agree. And if you ever want to do it again, cool. If anyone else who's watching wants to reach out directly or meet or do one of these, like count me in. If this becomes more of the norm, I think we've done something really nice today.
Right on. Thanks, Skippy.
All right, man. Bye, guys.
All right. Bye.